Aloha. So my name is Jonathan Cohen. I am the Senior Sustainability Policy Advisor in Boulder, Colorado. And today we are going to do something a little bit different. I know you've seen a lot of people up here talking. There's been a lot of, I think, really interesting, engaged conversation. And I think what we wanted to do with this panel is just to give you a little bit of a snapshot of some of the grand challenges that we're facing in Colorado. So I really appreciated the mayor's comments earlier this morning about neighbors, because I also would suggest that we are a neighbor island, just a very large island, about 2,500 miles to the east of here. But it does make me think in terms of those challenges that we face both here in the islands and in Colorado. They're very similar, though there are, I think, different dimensions and different drivers. So to that end, I don't know if Chairman Griffin or President Picker are still around. I know he's in the back, but I just went ahead and decided to add Colorado to that MOU. I hope that's okay. We'll just So let me kind of jump in. I have actually been honored to be part of this conference every year since its inception. And what I think has been so fascinating is there's always been this strong connection between Colorado and Hawaii. Both states have incredibly ambitious goals related to clean energy and climate. And in both states, the economics of renewables are really changing the game and creating those grand challenges that I mentioned. So just as Hawaii is wrestling with the best approach on how to unlock those opportunities to transition in a just and equitable way, Colorado is also kind of caught up in that transition of economics and energy economics. And let me give you an example. In Colorado, it is now cheaper to bring online new wind, transmit it, integrate it, than it is to run existing coal plants. Let that sink in for a moment. So in terms of how the market is driving behavior, it creates new challenges where we didn't see them before, meaning who bears the burden of those investments? How does that get translated to the ratepayers? How do you deal with those stranded assets or legacy units? So this creates a really interesting dynamic for a state. So again, I think we wanted to have more of a broad, kind of non-scripted conversation about some of the other dimensions associated with the energy transition as a panel. We talk a lot about economics and renewables, but one of the things that we are facing that we are hoping to share with you and maybe learn from you back is how we talk about things like the role of the state government, the role of local jurisdictions. And we talk a lot about equity and accessibility in this transition, and we refer to that as resilience. We've heard that word come up a number of times today. So rather than hearing me talk about it, what I'd like to do is turn to my amazing colleagues up here on the panel, because this is their expertise, and I'm really, really grateful to have them here with me. So rather than read their entire bios, I would encourage you to do so in the program because they really have impressive careers. I just want to introduce each one and then ask kind of some opening kind of questions to kind of get the conversation rolling. So first, just to my right, Taryn Fennessy is the Senior Climate Specialist for the state of Colorado, and she has done an incredible job kind of being able to support this bold statewide action. So I'm going to ask Taryn to talk specifically about the role of the state and how that's evolving. To her right is Anita Seitz. Anita is the Mayor Pro Tem of the city of Westminster, Colorado, and also the president of an organization that I'm really excited to introduce you all to, which is the Colorado Communities for Climate Action. And then finally, Paul Shanowski on the end. Paul is the director of the Environmental Design School at the University of Colorado in Boulder. But I think more importantly to this conversation, his company, Resilient Analytics, is really regarded as, I think, one of the leading firms that does vulnerability assessments and really thinking about climate change modeling. And so Paul is going to talk a bit about how resilience really fits into this equation in a broad way. So, okay, enough of introduction. Taryn, would you talk just briefly a little bit about your role at the state, and then maybe share with us just how you see the state kind of moving this transition forward and the role that it plays?
Sure. Am I on?
You're on.
Can you hear me? You can. So my position is really unique in that it's actually legislatively mandated that there be a person in the executive branch who coordinates our climate programs across state agencies. So I'm housed within the Department of Natural Resources, and I work really closely with all the departments across the state, as well as the governor's office, on our goals and initiatives. And that could be anything from transportation to public health to energy to water resources to drought, flood, and wildfire resilience. So every day is different, which makes it fun and exciting. And we are in a really unique position right now, or actually I guess not that unique. There's a lot of states that have just had a handoff of power from one governor to the next. Governor Hickenlooper was term limited, and we've now shifted to Governor Jared Polis. And one of his campaign promises was 100% renewable energy by 2040, which is a pretty ambitious goal. But this transformation is already underway in Colorado. I think one of the things that we think a lot about is the equity piece of it, the economics. How do we honor the agricultural component of Colorado while keeping energy affordable in rural areas? Our largest utility, Xcel, is really implementing renewable energy at an incredibly rapid pace, but that's not necessarily the case with some of our rural co-ops or some of our other providers. So how do we work with all the utilities across the board to implement our initiatives to reach 100% renewable by 2040? And then also, how do we think broadly beyond that? Because while in Colorado, the energy sector is still our largest source of emissions, nationally, it's transportation. So how do we think more broadly about electrification of vehicles, and then even more so electrification of homes, and keep going out in the concentric circles so that we are addressing this issue on all the various levels, because it really does impact all facets of our economy.
Thanks. So something you said just made me kind of think about the fact that this really raises this kind of interesting and important duality, which is how do we be kind of prudent while at the same time being bold and courageous? And I think that's one of the interesting things that kind of comes out of these conversations, which is, wow, how do we really think about moving forward? And I also just wanted to pick up on the fact that, yes, we have some really, really strong leadership from our new governor, but also there is a lot of legislation that's being dropped in terms of really aggressive goals around emission reductions. And we heard the governor talking earlier about really distinguishing between really, is it emissions? Is it renewables? How do you think about those things and the goals that they support? So, yeah, it's really interesting to see kind of what we are poised to accomplish in the near future. So, Anita, I want to turn to you and talk a little bit about the local role. So, Westminster is a really great example of those cities in Colorado who are recognizing the opportunities that present themselves in this transition. So, under your leadership, we've really seen Westminster become a leader. And in fact, in Colorado, we have, I think now, 10 to 12 cities that have created some type of renewable energy target, whether it be electricity or whether it be energy, including natural gas and petroleum for transportation. But that's pretty astounding when we start to see these local jurisdictions establish their own goals. So what do you see in terms of the role of locals moving forward? You have such a great connection, and then maybe to talk a little bit about CC4CA, and I think we'll come back and hit on that organization on a number of occasions.
So thank you, Jonathan. I would frame it as Westminster and local governments don't just see the opportunity through this transition, but they actually are seeing the liabilities of inaction and the cost to their communities of inaction. And so I think when you want to see what local governments are doing, you have to really take 2 steps back and see why. And that's because local governments are incredibly impacted by climate change. You can say extreme weather events, maybe a change from what historical norms, how our cities were built. But local governments bear a disproportional cost to extreme events. And so whether that's fire, our water systems, our roads, just public safety in general, these are all areas that are local jurisdiction. So we need to look at how are we going to protect ourselves for the future, right? And so as local governments, we're working together. I think the governor said we do better when we work together. He made a comment earlier about collaboration, and in Westminster, we recognize that as much as we're doing locally, and I could go through that, it's just going to be scratching the surface. So on a local level, what we've done is we've working on our building codes. I think there were a lot of people today that spoke upon the benefits of that. Like, we need to have energy efficiency. The best energy is energy we never use. And so that's obviously something that's within the wheelhouse of local governments. And so you'll see a lot of communities that are working on having higher energy efficiency standards. We're working on, transportation. That's another sector that has huge emissions. So it's not just looking at renewable energy. For a lot of local governments, we're looking at emissions, in addition to those 10 or 12 that have the renewable energy standards. So those are things that we're doing. But as far as renewables and broader policy, the Colorado Communities for Climate Action has come together. There are 25 different local governments, both counties and cities, and we advocate for state policy. So lobbying at both the State House, but also at the Public Utility Commissions, at the Air Quality Commissions, trying to make sure that the impacts to local governments are understood and that we have a voice at the table. And I think why it's important is that's really, we're the form of government that's closest to the people. So it's a signal, I think, to the market. It's a signal to other forms of government, higher forms of government. This is really what our consumers want, and this is for the protection of our communities. So I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, it did. Something you just said, we're closest to the people. One of the things that I think about often is that local government is a place where we interact with values. Mm-hmm. State doesn't typically, and no offense, I'm not saying that you don't have any values.
We have values too.
But I'm saying in terms of responding to a community's values is, I think, one of the unique roles. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to push you a little bit to respond to this second piece, if you don't mind. I think we often think about local government's role as, filling potholes, locking up bad guys, putting out fires. That's the role of local government. But I would argue that as you think about climate change, it truly represents a risk, and that there are vulnerabilities that we need to be thinking about. And so would you agree or disagree, you can disagree, that thinking about sustainability broadly, but resilience and climate issues are within the wheelhouse of local government, or do you think that they are kind of an appendage?
I think that you are not doing your job as a local leader if you are not considering the long-term impacts of climate. So every single one of our core services is impacted potentially by climate models. And so to me, this is paramount, because we're not just serving our residents of today, we're making sure that the decisions we make are fiscally responsible and they allow future generations to enjoy an affordable, high quality of life. So for me, this is fundamental to what I do, and this is well within the role and scope of my job.
I'm glad I got that right. And actually, it's a great segue to Paul, because you and I met when you had done an analysis for Boulder and Boulder County in terms of the actual costs to inaction, I guess is the way I would put it, to say, as we think about resilience and the role and the cost to local government, what that will look like is pretty staggering. And to being able to quantify that was something that I think was really, really unbelievably enlightening for a lot of policymakers, at least at the local level. So would you talk a little bit about resilient analytics and kind of how you see the intersection between resilience and this kind of transition that we've talked about a lot today in terms of the energy transition?
Sure. So when I first started doing this, got into it 12 years ago, the thing that we found that was really interesting was this lack of what is actually the cost of things. We tossed around words like resiliency and sustainability and being green, but what did that actually mean? What were we being resilient to? Was it being resilient to a big natural disaster? Was it being resilient to a long term? And so my work, which eventually turned into Resilient Analytics, was to put dollar events, because the problem that really exists is not every local community can have a Terran on board that's an expert, right? What we've done through lack of leadership at a national level is essentially abdicated to the states and then the local communities that every one of you has to be an expert on resiliency. You have to be an expert on what does it mean if our electric utility can't come back to function. And then you have to put a dollar amount to that. And that is where things get really tricky. What does it cost? And the reality is, yes, large events are a major concern, but the real cost is this little incremental piece that you have to deal with. What does it mean that your energy demands for cooling are going to keep going up every single year? What does that mean for public health? What does it mean that you're going to have kids in kindergarten in August that are going to have temperatures that are 5 or 10 degrees warmer than are usual in perhaps an unair-conditioned building? You're then in a public health issue. So when we're talking about resiliency and where it comes in, it's ultimately a risk and cost factor. And what we've done is we have to have the local governments really understand what the cost of this is. What's the potential impact? This is a risk factor. It's one of those pay me now or pay me later, but it's a whole lot less to pay me now than to wait 20 years because that's going to be a whole lot of cost that nobody can afford.
Can I add to that?
Please do.
So one of the things we're hearing from the state level is exactly that they want more information on how to anticipate not only these creeping costs, but the big event costs, because when you couple those together, that's what really breaks the system. And so in 2018, water is really important in Colorado. Like Hawaii, we're the only other water exporting state in the nation. We just have to share it with all of our neighbors. You guys share it with the ocean. But we had a really horrible drought in 2018, and as a result, we had horrible wildfires. And then we had some ash events following some monsoon rains. And what we've heard from some of these rural communities is we can't do another drought. We can't make it through. The economics of it just don't work. And what we're saying is, well, you're gonna have to. There's gonna be more droughts. There's gonna be more wildfires. And so how do we try to quantify these costs so that we can do a better job prioritizing and allocating resources and addressing the root cause so that our long-term costs are kept down?
Can I add something?
I'm quickly losing control. Go. Yeah, absolutely. No, please do.
So that type of information as a policy maker is critically important, right? So I am not a technical expert. I am somebody who, though, has this responsibility of being a good steward for my community. And so, you know, you get one swing, one try, and you want to make sure that you have the most sound possible policy outcome, because it's a missed opportunity otherwise. And so, I mean, it's so important that all levels of government get this information so that we're making the most of the policy that we employ.
Paul, do you want to respond?
I'll just say, I think that's the key part, is as public officials, there's a financial responsibility, there's a public safety responsibility, and just saying that, just not acknowledging something doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And I think that's the change we all have to make, is you can't stay ignorant of something. You have to acknowledge it, because that's the first step. And until we do that, we're never going to fix the problem.
So I wanted to connect a dot that I saw, connects kind of this line between something you said and something Anita said. And it has to do with kind of defining resilience, which I thought was really great. And one of the things that I think we are struggling with is often, maybe this is just me, when you think resilience, you think we got to build walls stronger, we need to make pipes bigger because we have more water to move, but there is such another dimension to this that is so critical. And the dot was back to kind of community values as we think about issues related to our ecosystems, to equity, to making sure when we get knocked down, which we will get knocked down, how do we help one another up again? So there is a social component to resilience that I think often gets overlooked, but do you think we are starting to sweep that in as we talk about equity, or do you think we have a lot more work to do there?
I think we have a lot more work to do. I think what we don't often understand is the people that are going to be affected first are the most vulnerable populations. They're the ones who are most dependent on getting aid in paying their electric bills or their utility bills. They're the ones who are most dependent on public transportation. And too often we tend to say the solution of this is oversimplistic. We'll say, well, if everyone just rode a bike, that'll take care of our emissions problem. Well, as we heard earlier, when you have people in California driving an hour and a half to work, that's not an option. They have to take public transportation, and public transportation is going to be affected by roads that are not in good shape or the fuel that costs more. And so it really is the vulnerable populations that are going to be affected first, and we have to not only recognize that, we have to be proactive about it, and we're not there yet.
Okay, this is a good shift. So that was an interesting one. How many in the audience were here at the conference 2 years ago when Gil Peñalosa was the keynote speaker? A handful of you, good. So it was really striking to me because Gil does community planning, and he really was up here talking about kind of connecting those dots around, kind of community values and how do you think about land use planning, because it all relates. And he went around the island and he took pictures, and his whole argument was, how can we assume people will just take transit when we make them second-class citizens? Right? I mean, that's kind of the stigma associated with using mass transit, or the idea that we have communities that don't have sidewalks, meaning that there's a disincentive to walk. So these are all kind of issues. So turning to that transportation piece, I want to, Taryn, kind of get back to you a little bit. We touched on this, we've heard a theme today around this idea of electricity versus energy. And in Colorado, and I think this is pretty standard, 99% of our emissions come from energy sources. So that's electricity, that's natural gas for heating and industrial processing, and that's petroleum for moving people around. So as we think about that, and we want to set ourselves up for a 100% kind of carbon-free future, in your thinking, what are some of the barriers that we've already overcome, some things that we've done right, and what do you see as kind of the looming big challenges that we have?
Sure. So I think one of the things we've done right is that we have a spirit of collaboration in Colorado, and we have worked really closely with our largest utilities to chart a path forward that is putting at least our urban centers on good footing, so that if they do want to move towards charging electric vehicles at their home, it's clean energy that they're charging with. If they want to install solar, it's reasonably cost effective to do so. And so I think we've addressed some of those issues, and I think that's a really big win. I think where we have bigger challenges as far as broader electrification is that our transportation systems outside the urban centers are not great. We're a really big state. We have narrow mountain corridors. There are real needs in some of our agricultural communities for big trucks. And there's not quite yet the market for those vehicles in a cost-effective way. We have co-ops in rural areas that are not a clean source of energy. And so even if you have an electric vehicle, you're charging it with electricity that's being produced by coal. It's a little, it's counterintuitive. And so I think some of the barriers are, how do we address that, and how do we acknowledge that, we don't all live in this urban center. We want that rural, thriving community in rural Colorado. We want to support those agricultural values. See, we do have values at the state. And at the same time, we want people going to our mountain corridors. We want people to enjoy Colorado for what Colorado is. And to see those other parts of the state, but we have to make it easy for them. We have to make it plausible. You can't have transit systems that take 2 or 3 times as long as if people were to take their individual cars. I think the other challenge that we have beyond that rural piece, and I want to add something that has been a really big shift in the last 5 years. It used to be that there was a little bit of an urban-rural divide, in that there was a demand for renewable energy in the urban centers, but not so much in the rural communities, and that has shifted. And the reason that has shifted actually goes back to resilience. And back to drought, in that we now have these utility scale wind and solar installations throughout rural Colorado, and we also have wind turbines on individual producers' farms. And what we found during these times of commodity price fluctuations or drought is that the income that is generated by those renewable energy projects is what makes these producers able to weather the storm. It's what makes these rural counties able to deal with those economic downturns. And so we're hearing from some of our most conservative rural communities in Colorado, we want more. We want more renewable energy. Help us get more. Because they see it as a strategy for dealing with the extreme variability that is inevitable. And I completely lost my train of thought on
That's okay.
where I was going after
because
that.
I was going to cut you off and ask you a question anyway. If you let me stay with this thread for just a minute longer. So that's a really interesting point, and it also kind of seems counter to what we are hearing or what we are feeling in some of the transitioning communities. Again, Colorado is a state that is largely dependent on many fossil fuels. We have communities that are built around coal mines and coal plants and a lot of natural gas development. And so there is this pinch point or this tension around how do we support those transitioning communities. So when we talk about equitability, that really means how do we support those communities to transition. There is a bill that was just introduced. It's going through the legislature right now that creates a fund to help those communities, which I think is a really interesting and novel way to, number one, accelerate the transition of those coal plants, but also create the fund to help. Do you see that being a barrier that we have, or something we've solved, or we still have a lot of work to do there?
Yes.
To both?
To both. I think that Colorado has done a really good job attracting clean tech jobs, and we actually now employ more people in the clean tech sector than we do in oil and gas and coal combined. And so we're doing a good job generating those clean tech jobs. There are places where you see the juxtaposition. Driving up I-25 in Pueblo, you can see the Vestas wind plant, and then you can see Comanche coal power plant right behind it. And so there is still room for improvement. And I think what we really need to do is help these communities create those high-paying jobs. There are opportunities with the renewable energy sector to do that, but there's retraining requirements, right? You can't just transfer one person from one profession to another. You have to provide them the tools and resources to succeed and excel. And so I think we do have more room to continue to improve in those areas, but I think we're at least putting the right foot forward and trying to continually trying to expand and attract more clean energy jobs to the state.
Awesome. Anita, you and I were talking at lunch, and one of the things that we were kind of chatting about is why local action is so important. Meaning we were kind of like, well, gosh, we have really kind of progressive cities, and we try to do good stuff, and then we bump our heads on regulation or legislation that is somewhat restrictive. And I use that as a preface to say, do you believe that the role of local jurisdictions is changing, and how important is it? And I guess I want you to talk a little bit more about CC4CA, because it's been extraordinary to see as you create that solidarity between a number of communities and all kind of lean into the issue a little bit. And you said earlier it represents 1/8 of the population of our state. And now we have a seat at the table to talk about policy reform. So I just want you to maybe talk about how important you have seen it, the effectiveness that you've seen through the actions of CC4CA, and maybe is it something that's replicable in other places?
So thanks for that question. I think as Paul's work becomes more and more understood by local government, we are trying to push and expand our role and really demand a seat at the table when it comes to state policy. And so Colorado Communities for Climate Action, again, these 25 communities has been very instrumental, I think, in trying to shape policy in the state, and we have successes under our belt. This year, it's going to be maybe easier for us because we have had a change in our state, in state governance, and have maybe people who are a little more sympathetic in seats now. But even last year, we did work really hard on the Colorado Energy Plan, lobbying the PUC, the Public Utility Commission, to really try to think about the benefits of retiring early to coal power plants and replacing them with utility scale renewables. But use that as an opportunity to also talk about balancing utility scale renewables with distributed generation and making sure that people can have solar at the site of consumption, and talking about the benefits, hopefully using the word and term that Jonathan and Paul are okay with, of resilience of the grid. So really adding that to the conversation. Similarly, when the federal government decided to leave behind clean car standards, our group mobilized and wrote a letter to then Taryn's boss, Governor Hickenlooper, asking him to keep clean standards in Colorado. To his credit, not because of us, he did make that decision. When the rulemaking went to our Air Quality Commission, we had representatives from really diverse communities there talking about why we need to have clean car standards. And one of the reasons is that equity piece, actually. When you send a signal to the market, innovation happens, right? It provides certainty to the market. They know where to invest. How to hit those standards, right? And so we also are going to push for zero emission vehicle standards. That's going to be the rulemaking processes for that. And one of the reasons that's so important to us is, again, for that equity lens. In Colorado, even though we have a pretty high adoption rate of zero emission vehicles or electric vehicles, we don't have every single zero emission vehicle that's on the market available for consumers to purchase. And in fact, I ended up just buying a hybrid recently, which I feel very hypocritical that I did not buy an EV, so it's confession. But it was really difficult looking for an EV. I would call dealerships to see if they had Leafs on their lot, and they'd have maybe two that weren't on their site. It was a little bit harder. So by having a requirement of a certain percentage of zero emission vehicles, it really, first off, forces the dealers to have them on their lots, forces them to promote them, and then it helps consumers because I think it drives down the cost.
I think the other thing that's a really big concern for Colorado, both from a cost standpoint but also from a public health standpoint, is that we have air quality standards that we're not meeting, and really big ozone issues, and cleaner transportation directly addresses those. Yes, it reduces greenhouse gas emissions, but that the reduction in ozone and the improved air quality has huge public health benefits. And we know that in Colorado, there is a disproportionate impact to some of our lower income communities who are seeing very high rates of asthma as a result of living right near transportation corridors. And so from a completely different lens, the public health lens, there are real benefits to the state of Colorado in adopting clean car standards.
So just to kind of continue this a little bit, you know, it's interesting because as a constituency, local governments are quite different than the typical groups that either lobby at the state capitol or have a seat at the table that help shape policy, whether it be bills or something at our public health department or at the Public Utilities Commission. And the difference is that we are very diverse. We're diverse within each community. We represent low and fixed income. We represent businesses, small and large. We represent grassroots nonprofits. So we try to represent all of those interests. And I think what's been so interesting to watch is just how those get transferred into kind of the sausage making in terms of how policy comes out the other side. And it's really been fascinating. So just one of those things around transportation, which I would just suggest, and I want to kind of come back and talk about energy with Paul directly. As we think about what is in front of us now, transportation is a really interesting one. So, you know, in Boulder, we've really been pushing electric transit for some time. Electric fleets, TNCs, and how you look at shared fleet opportunities and storage. And we ran a pilot program where we subsidized the cost of lease and sold almost 300 in 2 months. And then you run into the challenges of, wait, okay, now how do we address land use policies around DC fast charging and more of the multimodal corridor opportunities? And so just as you think you've solved one thing, suddenly you have multiple challenges, but the way we are working to address those kind of creates a pathway to continue to work together. Sorry, a little bit of a monologue, but it's been fascinating. Then the other thing that I wanted for Paul to talk about is this electrification. And this is something that is not unique just to Colorado, but in terms of electrification of our natural gas is such a big issue. So we have a utility that, again, is electric and natural gas provider, mostly just one investor in utility. But as we think about how do we make this transition at the residential and commercial level, it's a big challenge, and we have not cracked that one yet. Paul, when you think about energy, kind of applying your resilience lens, what are some of the biggest challenges you are thinking about? And I also wanted you to talk about the difference you see between reliability and resilience in the energy space. I think we use those interchangeably, and I don't think that they are, but I'd love to hear you talk about that.
So I think the one thing that concerns me more than anything else is looking at the future demand for energy. I think one thing that we tend to do is always live in the moment, right? We always live in, here's where we are now, here's where we have been in the past, here's where that incremental, that population growth is going to be. And for me, I'm very concerned about the average person who doesn't get heard, who's living in a house somewhere that maybe is 30, 40 years old, is not very energy efficient, may or may not have air conditioning, and doesn't feel like they have a voice in anything. And they're the ones who are facing, I can't afford to move, I can't afford to redo my house to make it more energy efficient, I need to get better systems, air conditioning, but I can't afford it. How do we represent these people? There's a lot more of those people than the people who are speaking up. And so when I think of resilience and reliability, reliability is actually making sure these people have the resources that they need day to day, that they can go on with their lives that we're so dependent on, that they don't have to worry about their kids getting sick because of air quality. So knowing that the systems go on, and we heard some great things, Hawaii's doing some great things with the battery backups and solar, but that's different than 99% of the country. And so reliability, the average person doesn't necessarily think about resilience in terms of how do I get back when the big event hits. They're thinking about when the wind comes up, is there power going out and is it going to come back on, right, day to day. And so reliability is really let's keep it going, whereas resilience is how do we come back or how do we adapt to these long-standing changes. And my concern in a lot of this is we hear from the people who can afford to talk. We hear from, in Colorado, the big oil and gas industries who have a vested interest in keeping things the same. And I think as local governments, what we need to do is make sure that there's reliability and resilience for the average person. And that's the energy concern I have is, yeah, we can fix it for people that can afford it. What are we going to do for the people who can't afford it? And that's the concern that I have, that I see across the country, that we may be ahead in some things, but we're not ahead for everybody. And how are we going to address that?
Something you just said kind of prompted a question, and it really had to do with some of the interests that really are interested in maintaining status quo. I think there are a number of factors that would love to see things not change, and do you see some tension? I do, so maybe this is kind of a loaded question. How do you think the state is handling kind of this tension between I think a very progressive legislature right now. A lot of the agencies are really leaning forward and trying to be progressive, yet we have some very strong interests within the state that don't want to see that change. How do you see that playing out?
So Colorado has had a unique shift recently. So if you don't know, we went from being an incredibly purple state with a split legislature and split elected offices to a Democratic legislature, governor's office, and actually all our major elected offices, attorney general, so on, went Democratic, and so it's been a really big shift within Colorado, and I think has concerned a lot of people that the pendulum would swing too far in one direction. And there are very real concerns. 75% of our natural resource program is funded through severance tax. So if we are decreasing how much drilling we're doing or how much severance tax we're getting, how are we funding some of those natural resource programs? And so there are challenges. There are very real challenges to overcoming some of those barriers. Change is scary. But change isn't just scary, there are opportunities in it. And I always think back to, when we were transitioning from typewriters to computers, none of the typewriter salespeople wanted us to shift to computers. It was scary. It was a new technology, a new way of doing things. But I don't think now, in retrospect, on some days I might actually think of going back to less technology. But on most days, technology helps us function in a more efficient way. And a lot of the progress we've made now is a result of those technological advances. So there are opportunities as well as challenges. And I think what we need to do are find those opportunities, but make sure that when we're looking for those opportunities, we're not just looking for the opportunities for the big businesses to succeed, but to really bring everybody along with us. How does distributed solar help people in rural areas have lower energy costs? How do we utilize these renewable energy projects to bring higher tax revenue to rural Colorado so they can adjust childhood poverty rates, right? Those resources don't necessarily need to go back into dealing with climate change. They can address societal needs. And when we go around to rural Colorado and we talk to these local communities about what their biggest issues are, it's mental health concerns, it's teen suicide, it's meth and opiate addiction, it is drought. But there are really very real here and now issues. And so it is coming from a place of privilege for us to talk about energy efficiency and installing new windows in our house and all of these things. It's coming from a place of privilege. And so I think we need to think more creatively about how do we make those things more accessible. We have programs at the state through our weatherization program and some of our low-income incentive projects. We're working to extend tax credits on EVs during this legislative term. But again, those people that are buying those brand new $30,000 cars are not the same people who are going to be really pinched if their utility costs go up by 10% year on year. And so I think we need to think a little bit more comprehensively and creatively about where are those opportunities and how do we make them opportunities for all instead of a privileged few.
Your comment about change reminded me of something that my daughter asked me the other day. She said, "What apps did you like when you were a kid?" 2008, folks, that's when apps became a reality. 2008.
My son calls it the old years. He goes, "Mama, you didn't even have a computer in the old years."
So Anita, Taryn talked about opportunities, and you have been such a champion in Westminster, honestly, and I really see Westminster and other cities popping up around the state that are not the Boulders and the Aspens and the Fort Collins, and it's such a really interesting story. I also kind of put Pueblo in that category, where you have a very different politically community that is, never expected to pass something like 100% renewable energy target, doing so. What do you think is driving that? And just speaking from your position as an elected official and kind of how you are championing this transition in Westminster, in the circle that you run in, what do you think is moving the needle?
So to give you all some context about my community, we're in between Denver and Boulder. We're a population of about 115,000, and we are not a reputation, our city's reputation is not being a very progressive, affluent community. We're very blue collar, but this is the fundamental thing that I think is important. It shouldn't be a privilege to care about the impacts to the environment, right? It is not a privilege to worry about like the fiscal long-term health of my community. This is just very baseline human needs. Folks in my community that live in the part of town that has maybe a lower socioeconomic demographic, they don't have air conditioning, right? They don't have easy access to transit. These are the people who will be most impacted by future events. They live closer to the floodplain. This is, so as a local leader, I think it's incredibly important to elevate those voices because a lot of people don't have the time, right? It's not that they don't know. It's not that they don't care. They are living their lives. And they rely on us, who they voted for, to be doing that type of advocacy work for them. And so, what we've done in Westminster to work on equity, to try to make sure that everyone can participate, is we've done things like we have public electric vehicle charging stations, right? We have removed a lot of the costs to adding solar to homes. But we also have solar gardens, so people can subscribe to that membership. So there's ways to participate that you take away some of those barriers to entry, those fiscal barriers to entry. And then we continue to push the needle. I will tell you, we have a lot of diversity in Colorado, like you talked about. Your community has benefited the rest of us, because I'm never going to recommend municipalization in my community. It's not a solution that's gonna work for my community. However, I firmly believe that it has pushed the needle on the entire conversation. Xcel Energy, I think, has responded, because when communities like mine and Pueblo and Longmont, all of these other communities, maybe not in their area, but they start seeing this groundswell of wanting to have 100% renewable energy, they recognize this is more than Boulder. This is a movement. And this is a strong signal. So I have to say thank you to the communities that push the needle further. And we're going to do everything we can by pushing as well, but maybe in a different way.
Happy to take one for the team. So Paul, thank you. Paul, I wanted to just maybe kind of shift, and then we actually have some really cool questions coming in that I wanted to get to. But I wanted to ask you a little bit. So what you've heard today from the other panels and kind of applying your resilience lens, what advice would you have for the audience members in Hawaii? I mean, I think they have really amazing folks working on resilience here, but from your perspective, what would you say as kind of the big levers that they ought to be thinking about?
It's a great question. So I think here in Hawaii, the big advantage you've got is you're already a couple of steps ahead of where most of the rest of the country is, and that's fantastic. I applaud you for that. I think the levers to really think about the what's next is what are you actually planning for? I was talking to Jonathan earlier. We're really an ethical problem. So when you're thinking about what you're doing and what you're taking this next step in renewables, are you planning for what the building and energy codes are today, which really are backwards looking, right? Everything that's legally binding today for a designer or regulator is what's been happening the last 30 and 40 years. That's all we're legally required to do, and that's all we're legally required to adapt for and be resilient for. That's great. But ethically, we're really charged with, are you looking at what's going to happen 20 and 30 years from now? And I think that's really the lever that really is to be pushed on harder is you're planning for the next generation. And if you're going to be a leader, why not lead in planning for the future and not just planning for today? And that's what I think, from what I've heard, is you've already taken the first several steps, the important steps. You know what's there. You know what has to be done. Now take it to the next step and say, we're not only going to solve for now, for the next 5 years, we're going to put the infrastructure in place that's going to meet the needs for the next 30 years. And that's what we need, is that leadership at local level, at state level. That's the thing to pull. We're going to be leaders on what we're not required to do, but what we need to do. And I think that's what we need, is that leadership.
Excellent, thanks. So I wanted to thank everybody. We have some time to do some questions, but I appreciate that you are actually responding and asking questions. That means that you are not napping, so I appreciate that very much. So
we appreciate it too.
I'm gonna pick one and ask you all to maybe consider this, because I think it's a really interesting one. So first, maybe this is mostly for Taryn. Emissions from agriculture. What are we trying to do to address agricultural emissions? And I think that's really fascinating because, again, Anita and I were just talking about how are we measuring emissions? Are we doing it effectively? Do we do it the right way? You know, this idea that you put a bubble over each city and just measure those emissions is not effective. You're not measuring the right stuff. And if you're not measuring the right stuff, then you're not implementing the right strategies to deal with that stuff. So thinking about agriculture, how does that play into the statewide inventory? And I think what's so interesting is that we have a number of bills that have lined up that are really going to ratchet up how Colorado looks at sector-specific emissions, how we create the authorities to actually monitor and redo forecasts, redo our inventories on a regular basis. So I think we're ready to accelerate, but talk about that a little bit if you don't mind.
So I think first there's been a lot of discrepancy across the research community on the contribution of agriculture to agricultural emissions, and so I think there's been some studies that have said, you know, it's more than transportation. Those have largely been disputed, but agriculture is unique in that it is both a source and a sink, right? And so, yes, we have, you know, Colorado has dairies and we have a lot of cattle. We use big tractors to harvest our wheat. So we have lots of sources of emissions, but we also have found that improving our soil health in our prairie lands can actually be a really good sink for carbon. We've invested a ton of money into energy efficiency within dairies, and the return on investment is months, not even years, which is just kind of unheard of. It's about 6 months return on investments with some of these projects, and we went from a pilot project to a full-fledged statewide project within about 5 years because it was just it made so much sense, and have since expanded even beyond the dairy industry. And so I think there are best management practices, but there are a lot of opportunities within our natural and working lands to look at how do we better utilize cover crops? How do we increase our soil health? And again, think about the co-benefits. It's not just from an emissions standpoint. Yes, we know that healthier soil holds more carbon, but it also uses less water, something we don't have a lot of in Colorado. And it doesn't blow as much when it gets stressed. And so there are all these reasons to pursue these best management practices that exist outside the realm of just the carbon mitigation, and we're starting to see industry demand them. General Mills now has greenhouse gas emission reduction goals that are largely focused on soil health and cover crops, and the grain industries, which is a huge, is our largest kind of crop industry within Colorado, are grains. And then even Walmart, the world's largest grocery store, is implementing new sustainability rules that require producers to follow these best management practices. And from what I've seen from folks on the ground, they love these because agriculture are cost takers, not cost makers, or price takers, not price makers. They don't have a choice in what they get for their commodity. And so their only way to influence their profit margins is to decrease their overall costs. So if they're implementing precision agriculture where they're putting in less fertilizers based on really incredible technology that is actually telling them every couple inches how much nutrients the soil needs, they are both decreasing their emissions, but they're also decreasing their costs. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities, and we have seen the agricultural community really embrace these ideas and want more, and that's where we're having to really kind of scale up very, very fast, is to meet these needs of our agricultural community. And it's not isolated just to crops. We're seeing it within the Cattlemen's Association as well. And so I think that everyone is realizing that they have a role to play, and they're trying to find the nexus, and they're trying to get up to speed as fast as possible.
Excellent. Okay, so this next question, I'm going to take some liberty and modify it just slightly because I want to expand it. And so it's this. What have you found most successful in engaging the public to support your resiliency efforts so they aren't just mandates? And I would replace resiliency with resilience and climate, because I think they often come out as particular mandates to our community members, whether it be building codes or efficiency programs, et cetera. I'll let you two thumb wrestle on who answers first, because I think it's for both of you.
So the best thing that I found is public education. That is the places that I've worked that have seen the best action are when the average person is educated about what the actual issues are. When they are talking about it, I always say when the topic of conversation at a dinner party becomes talking about climate, or when they're going to the store and they're talking about it, that's when they start taking action. And my favorite example is in Florida. We don't often get to learn things from Florida, but here's a case where we do. Here's what we do. Even though we're not allowed to talk about climate change in Florida, some of the local communities are being the most aggressive in terms of what they're doing. And primarily it's because they are educating their people about, hey, this is important, the sea level rise, the storms, whatever it is. And I think that's your key thing. You've got to get out there and make sure the average person understands it as it relates to them. You don't always have to talk about 2 degrees centigrade and climate science. You talk about things about your 2-day shipping, and are they going to get packages if the planes can't fly?
But Paul, let me just ask, do you think we have the luxury of taking the time to increase literacy? Meaning, if the predictions are right and we truly have a decade to get this right, the problem with literacy is it takes time. So my question is, at least in my community, it's like, you know what, mandates, that's what it's going to be. We're going to set some requirements, and I'm not suggesting that you're wrong. I'm just kind of curious, because I think there is this notion that as long as we bring people along, that somehow we will get there. But I don't know if we have the time.
I think it's going to be a combination. I think ultimately you're going to need mandates. The problem is, if all you do is mandates, people are going to start to push back because they're not going to understand why you're doing mandates. And an angry populace is far less effective than educated populace. So it's going to take a combination, and people will only take mandates for so long when they don't understand them. And so you can have mandates, but you've got to be equally strong as to why you're doing it.
That's fair. Anita?
So I agree. You get pushback, right, whenever you are mandating anything. But I think in Colorado, I think there's a sensibility of kind of protecting the Colorado way of life, right, that is shared both by our corporate partners and by our residents. And so talking about being clear and transparent about why you have a rule, right? Make sure you're fair in how you're enforcing it, right? You're equitable in how you're enforcing it, and that you're always connecting it to the public value. I think that's the best way to get buy-in. You and I, we talked at lunch about time horizons. And so as a local government, my job, I would say we shouldn't just be thinking about it. I think that should be required of local government. We're always thinking about the long-term impacts of any policy that we put into place. We can't expect builders or the private sector to necessarily have that same time horizon. That's just not in their interest, and that's not because they're bad or they're, and we're good. It's just because we have different stakeholders. And so when you communicate that, listen, we're going to require this level of energy efficiency, but it's because that's going to lower the cost to residents over time, which will lower the impact on our grid, which will lower, talking about who it benefits and why, I think is important. So that's the education piece. But I think the other part of it is having a balanced strategy for how you employ this. You have the carrots, you have the stick, and you have the education, and using each when it's appropriate. Because I don't think we have time for long-term cultural change. We have to act now, but it doesn't mean we stop talking about it.
Excellent. Okay, we are out of time. I'm going to offer the three of you up for any additional questions during the coffee break. Hope that's okay. And I just wanted to end with a little bit of gratitude. I often think that the most powerful and insidious force that we face is resignation, meaning that this numb acceptance that we can't change things. Every time I have so much gratitude coming to Maui for this conference. You're incredible hosts. I appreciate it so much. I have gratitude, of course, for my panelists for taking their time to be here with us to share their knowledge, and to all of you for taking your time to listen to this conversation and to be part of this conference. So thank you so much.